15,000 residents. A quiet American town. The kind where neighbors know each other better than their own families. A place where evenings leave the streets almost empty. And news of a missing person sounds too wild to believe on the first try. When on the 24th of September 2018, Emma's parents realized that their daughter had not returned home after school, silence fell first. The town, accustomed to measured pace and tranquility, seemed to hold its breath. At 8:30 in the evening, not having waited for Emma, her father, Richard, was the first to call the local police department. The man's voice was calm, confident, but too even, too restrained. As if fear had already settled inside, which he did not want to show others. Or perhaps could not. The first hours were spent on checks, school, neighboring yards, family friends. No traces. Someone remembered seeing Emma at a crosswalk. Someone else saw her turning onto the street leading toward her home. Everything seemed logical, but the ends did not meet. The route where she was seen was too short to simply disappear without a trace. The next morning, the town was already different. When around 11 o'clock in the afternoon, police officers discovered what they were looking for, the atmosphere in the town changed completely and irreversibly. Emma was found in a forest strip, approximately 1 kilometer from the nearest residential street. Someone had tried to hide her from prying eyes, carefully covered her with fallen leaves, covered her from above with broken branches. Even Emma's school backpack stood neatly beside her, as if someone had tried to preserve at least an appearance of order amidst chaos. The forensic expert at the scene established that death had occurred several hours before discovery. No weapon was found. Marks on the neck spoke for themselves. Strangulation. But here was what was strange. No signs of struggle. No attempts to escape or call for help. Emma clearly knew the person who brought her there, trusted enough not to sense danger until the last moment. The first question the investigators asked themselves was who among those close to her could make her lose vigilance so completely. Police immediately began a door-to-door canvass. A witness, an elderly woman from a neighboring block, remembered that in the evening around 6, when she was walking her dog, a grey-colored car stood near the road leading to the forest strip. The car seemed familiar to her, but the woman did not remember the license plate, attributing everything to the fact that in their quiet place, strange cars usually do not linger long. Her testimony was confirmed by a local resident, farmer Jack Lawson. He said that in the evening he saw the same grey car but did not pay attention. The car stood briefly, left quickly without even turning off the engine. Investigators made a note, grey automobile, and began checking everyone who could match this description. Jason Lee, 27 years old, who worked as a janitor at Emma's school, immediately fell under first suspicion. Nothing serious, but minor offenses were in his biography. He had already made his mark with police for minor fights and hooliganism. Moreover, Jason drove precisely a grey automobile, an old Ford, which was regularly seen near the school and on neighboring streets. During the first interrogation, Jason appeared noticeably nervous. He had no clear alibi for the evening of Emma's disappearance. He said he had a drink after his shift and drove aimlessly around the outskirts. His testimony was confused. His version sounded strange. He seemed to be trying to hide something but could never explain what exactly. Another candidate appeared, almost immediately. Thomas Kennedy, better known as simply Tom, a lonely pensioner living literally across the street from Emma's family. Tom had lived here his entire life, and neighbors were accustomed to his quiet, slightly withdrawn lifestyle. However, after Emma's disappearance, people remembered Tom quite differently. Some suddenly began to notice that he too often sat on the porch and looked for long periods at how local kids played in the yard. Police paid him a visit, and after a brief interrogation left with the feeling that Tom was nervous no less than Jason, though he remained calmer. He assured them that he had spent the entire evening sitting at home watching television, but no one could confirm this. Tom, lived alone. When asked why neighbors saw him on the street around 7 in the evening, he said he had only gone out to check the mail. It was impossible to verify this, which meant there remained reason for doubt. Against the backdrop of the first suspicions, police decided to detain Jason Lee for a more detailed conversation. They examined his car, trying to find at least some traces connecting him to the incident. Jason himself was confused, nervous, but categorically denied that he was involved in what happened. Examination of his clothing and hands yielded nothing substantial except for several scratches whose origin he explained by his work. Jason's car was empty. Nothing unusual. It seemed suspicion was gradually exhausting itself. By the end of the day, a forensic expert made an important discovery that instantly changed the entire course of the investigation. In Emma's palm, he found a small souvenir keychain with an image of an angel and an inscription from the local church. Such keychains children received exclusively during Sunday service. Emma's family rarely attended church, but the keychain turned out to be in her hand, not by accident. Forensic analysis immediately showed that there was foreign DNA on the keychain. It did not belong to Jason or anyone from Emma's family. This meant only one thing. Someone whom police had not yet thought about had entered the circle of suspects. But the main mystery lay elsewhere. The keychain meant that in the last minutes of her life, Emma was not simply alone with a person she knew. She was with someone she was accustomed to trusting completely. Someone who raised no one's doubts. Not yet, anyway. With the discovery of the keychain, the entire dynamics of the investigation changed sharply. Until this moment, the search had proceeded according to standard scheme. Neighborhood, suspicious individuals, obvious coincidences. Now the investigation acquired new depth, and the clue itself not only confused the trail, but also spoke of the fact that Emma led a life unknown even to those closest to her. The small souvenir with an angel was not simply a random detail. This was evidence that made everyone think about how little the town's residents know about each other, even if it seems they have been acquainted their whole lives. Experts confirmed. The keychain found in Emma's palm could only be obtained during Sunday meetings for the youngest parishioners of the local church. For the investigation, this discovery meant that Emma visited a place where her family was extremely rarely, and even then, only on days of major holidays. Police officers immediately went to speak with Emma's parents, Richard and Carolyn. The spouses looked bewildered. Neither of them even supposed that Emma could go somewhere without their knowledge, especially to church. The family never had strict religious traditions, and if Emma had wanted to go to some service or event, she surely would have told her mother about it. But Caroline only shook her head, repeating, "This cannot be." However, the fact remained a fact. The keychain was found precisely with Emma, and this required an answer. The investigators decided to take a different path. They went to the school to talk with classmates and find out if someone might have invited Emma to visit the parish. At the school, it quickly became clear that some of Emma's peers indeed attended Sunday gatherings at the local church. Several girls immediately confirmed that Emma had joined them a couple of times, but always asked them not to tell about it. She seemed to want her visits to remain secret from her parents. When one of her friends asked her why she was hiding this, Emma simply smiled and said that Mom might get angry if she found out. These words were unexpected even for the parents themselves. Richard and Caroline just looked at each other, not understanding why their daughter could fear such an innocent confession. But this was only the beginning of the surprising discoveries toward which the investigation was rapidly moving. The next target of the investigation was obvious: the church and its congregation. The investigators came there during the day when no one except the clergy was there. Pastor Joseph turned out to be a person whom almost everyone in the town knew. Young, only 33 years old, open and smiling with a soft, welcoming voice, he quickly became a center of attraction for local residents. He was especially loved by those who were younger, thanks to his charisma and ability to always find the right words. When the detectives asked Joseph about Emma, he first even seemed surprised, as if hearing this name for the first time. However, within a minute he remembered her, describing her as a quiet and shy child who had appeared in church several times in the company of other children. The pastor was surprised that Emma had hidden these visits from her parents, and assured that if he had known about this earlier, he would have definitely talked with the family. But no one had told him anything, and therefore he had remained silent. Pastor Joseph described the evening of Emma's disappearance without hesitation. He was in a neighboring town on church business, meeting with representatives of another congregation, and returned late at night. When asked if someone could confirm this, Joseph answered calmly and did not even change his expression, explaining that cameras on the highway and gas stations had surely recorded his trip. The police officers made notes, understanding that checking the alibi would take several days. However, the detectives already sensed a thin thread of tension in this perfectly calm story. Why was the pastor, who spoke so confidently about his trip, clearly nervous when Emma was mentioned? While experts studied the recording from video surveillance cameras on the roads, the investigation again turned to Tom, the elderly neighbor of Emma's family. Earlier, he had already been suspected, but no clear grounds for accusation were found. This time, the police decided to act more harshly. A warrant was obtained to search the pensioner's house. Tom's house turned out to be not simply old and lonely. It was literally filled with things that did not correspond to his age and lifestyle at all. The investigators found many old toys, children's clothing, and even photographs of children unknown to them. Tom calmly explained, all this belonged to his sister's children, who had died several years ago. He had kept their things as a memory, not wanting to part with the only reminder of his relatives. It seemed logical, but somehow unconvincing. Despite the strangeness of the situation, none of the found items was connected to Emma or her disappearance. The police cautiously retreated. The evidence was weak, though disturbing. 2 days later, results of DNA analysis from the church keychain came from the forensic laboratory. The experts gave a clear portrait of the suspect, a young man aged from 25 to 35 years old. This automatically excluded the elderly neighbor Tom, who at the time of the events was already well over 60. At the same minute, as if confirming the investigators' fears, another message came, now from the police of a neighboring state. The detectives had requested information on Joseph, the pastor who had behaved too calmly during the first interrogation. It turned out that just a couple of years ago in his previous parish, police had conducted an investigation after several complaints from parents. They reported questionable behavior by the pastor toward younger parishioners. However, formally, no charges were brought because concrete evidence was never found then. Now Joseph turned out to be not just a charismatic priest. He was a person who already had something on record that made police pay close attention to him. The investigation again rapidly accelerated, and the circle of suspects again narrowed to one name, around which all the threads and evidence were now gathering. A name that until recently no one in town had dared even to pronounce aloud with suspicion. After receiving disturbing information from the neighboring state, the investigation entered an active stage. Police began a thorough check of Pastor Joseph Miller's biography, intending to understand why he had changed 3 parishes in 3 different towns over the past 5 years. In each of these places, Miller began the same way. He easily won the trust of parishioners, became one of their own, especially for those who were not yet 10 years old. The first calls to previous parishes gave contradictory results. Former parishioners spoke about Joseph differently. For some, he remained a talented, caring servant of the church. To others, he seemed a suspicious person whose excessive care looked inappropriate. Parents cautiously admitted that Miller sometimes showed strange attention to the youngest parishioners. For example, he could spend hours communicating with them alone in his office, or often invited them to church separately from adults. However, no one then filed concrete complaints or official accusations. Everything remained at the level of hints and rumors, which were insufficient to begin a serious investigation. Meanwhile, When police officers again called the pastor for a conversation, he had noticeably changed. This time, Joseph was no longer so confident. His answers became less clear, and his voice tense. This was especially apparent when clarifying his alibi. The investigators asked him a simple question: why cameras at nearby gas stations had not recorded his car at the time he had indicated. First, the pastor referred to a possible camera malfunction, then suggested that he might have refueled at another section of the highway. The detectives continued to press, clarifying details of the trip. Joseph got confused, mixed up streets and road numbers, then fell silent altogether, asking for a lawyer. This was that very moment when it became clear the clergyman was seriously hiding something. In parallel, police officers began checking witness testimony. Several people confirmed that on the evening when Emma disappeared, they had seen the pastor in town, and not alone, but in the company of someone else who by age could have been younger than 10 years old. Someone claimed that he had stopped at a store. Someone that they had seen him near a small park adjacent to the forest belt where Emma was later found. The witnesses were certain that it was precisely the pastor. His figure and gait were recognizable even in twilight. Police began obtaining recordings from city surveillance cameras. Time was counting, but reviewing the material was lengthy, and each hour without results intensified anxiety in the small town. Residents were nervous, and rumors began circulating in the city that only made the atmosphere heavier. Joseph had already stopped being the person to whom parishioners were drawn. He had turned into a person who was watched with caution and even fear. While the investigation's attention was focused on the pastor, the town was shaken by a new, unexpected discovery. In an abandoned garage on the outskirts, they found the gray Ford of Jason Lee, that same young school janitor who had been actively suspected in the first days of the investigation. Someone had stolen the car and abandoned it here, deliberately hiding it from prying eyes. When the police officers opened the car door, an unexpected and eerie surprise awaited them. The back seat was strewn with children's items, old toys, small dresses, t-shirts, and even a pair of shoes. Nothing found belonged to Emma, but the very fact of having such items in the car of a young man who already had problems with the law looked extremely suspicious. Jason was detained again and called for urgent interrogation. The young man looked completely depressed and confused when the police officers explained the situation to him. He categorically denied having any connection to the found items. Moreover, Jason assured them that his car had been stolen the night before, while he himself was at the station giving testimony. The statement seemed doubtful, but the police were obliged to check this version. The investigation had reached another dead end. Was Jason a victim of a setup, or was he trying to cover his tracks? What turned out to be important and unexpected was that Jason's statement about the car theft was confirmed by a camera installed in the parking lot near his house. The recording clearly captured how an unknown man, carefully hiding his face under a hood, broke into the car, started it, and quickly drove away. The time on the recording completely coincided with the moment when Jason was at the station and physically could not have committed this crime. The police came to the only logical conclusion. Everything they saw was a deliberate attempt by someone to frame Jason as guilty, direct the investigation along a false path, and distract attention from the true criminal. Meanwhile, specialists from the laboratory continued to analyze the evidence obtained at the discovery sites. New results confirmed the police's fears. On the items found in the stolen car, fingerprints and DNA were discovered that partially matched those previously found on the church keychain from Emma's palm. This was a clear signal that the person who planted the items in Jason's car was directly connected to the crime. It was at this moment that a new stack of documents landed on the senior detective's desk. These were camera printouts obtained from the highway leading to the neighboring city. The long-awaited check yielded results. Pastor Joseph's car did not appear on the evening he indicated at any of the possible video surveillance points. And this meant only one thing. Joseph had lied, deliberately confusing the investigation. The police were confident that solving the crime was very close. And although formalities still remained before the arrest, there were no longer any doubts at the station about exactly who they were dealing with. Now it only remained to gather all the evidence together and understand how exactly Joseph had managed to hide his secrets for so long and so carefully. But most importantly, they already understood that he was ready to go much further than it seemed before. The investigation no longer doubted that Jason's car had been stolen deliberately to send the police down the wrong path. It remained to find out who exactly was behind this calculated move. The police began studying video camera footage throughout the city, particularly carefully checking gas stations and parking lots on the night of the car theft. On the surveillance camera footage from a gas station on the outskirts of the city, a man was spotted who had driven up late at night, literally a few hours before Jason's abandoned car was found. The person in the video clearly avoided getting into the frame, constantly turning his face away, and paid with cash. But the police officers carefully studied the recording several times, paying attention to all the details: gait, gestures, clothing. When a copy of the video was shown to the gas station employee, he carefully watched the recording and immediately confidently stated that he recognized this man. Despite the hidden face, he immediately noted the voice and characteristic gestures of the customer. There was almost no doubt left. Before him was Pastor Joseph Miller. In the recording, he was buying gasoline in a small canister, but even such a simple fact took on an ominous tone. Joseph was a person who could move around the city unnoticed without attracting suspicion, especially at such a time of night. The police immediately obtained a warrant to conduct a thorough search of the pastor's house. They no longer wasted time on formalities. The pastor's house was typical for a small town. Simple, well-maintained, with modest furnishings, without excesses. However, during the search, in the drawer of Joseph's desk, keychains identical to the one found in Emma's hand were discovered. There were several of them, all new, carefully folded in a box. At first, this looked quite logical. The pastor could keep such souvenirs for parishioners. However, it took experts little time to discover among them a keychain that had the same fingerprints and DNA as on the evidence found with Emma. When the pastor was presented with the find, he looked confused, but quickly collected himself and gave a quite confident answer. Joseph declared that different people constantly came to the church, parishioners and guests. Anyone could take a keychain from the box on the table and then plant it back there. He spoke confidently, convincing the investigation that this was a setup, clearly organized by a person who had access to his workplace. The pastor immediately remembered his former assistant Mark Thompson, whom he had recently fired due to accusations of financial fraud. Joseph claimed that Mark had sworn to take revenge on him and could well have organized this whole story with the keychains and the car. The police were forced to seriously check the pastor's words, despite the increasing amount of evidence clearly pointing to him. Mark Thompson indeed had a conflict with Joseph and was forced to leave the city after accusations of stealing money from the church treasury. Mark was quickly found in a neighboring town where he had been living for the past weeks. During the check, it turned out that Mark had an iron alibi. On the day of Emma's disappearance, and especially on the night of the car theft, he was in another place. Records from cameras at the hotel where he lived completely confirmed his words. Thompson had not left the neighboring town for several days. This meant that the pastor's accusations were an attempt to desperately throw suspicion off himself and find at least some opportunity to avoid further police questions. When the investigation informed Joseph about the results of checking Mark's alibi, the pastor was noticeably nervous. He began to get confused, give increasingly incoherent explanations, and soon fell completely silent, refusing to comment. It was obvious that his calm and confidence had been completely destroyed. The detectives returned again to the main evidence: the keychain, gasoline, stolen car, attempts to frame Jason. All this indicated that the pastor was ready to do a lot to avoid responsibility. Simultaneously, data began coming in from technical specialists who were checking Joseph's mobile phone. His phone showed that on the evening of Emma's disappearance, he was within the city limits, not on the road as he had claimed earlier. This became another serious blow to his version. Each subsequent step by the detectives brought them closer to the finale of the investigation. Joseph was under constant surveillance. The police were preparing for the official filing of charges, and the entire community, which had previously admired the pastor, had already turned away from him. But the main evidence that changed the entire course of events came completely unexpectedly. The owner of a small grocery store on the outskirts of town was reviewing recordings from his surveillance cameras at the police's request. He was the first to notice an unusual frame captured by a camera facing the road leading to the forest belt. The recording was made on the evening of Emma's disappearance. Clearly and distinctly, despite the twilight, two figures could be seen on it. One clearly belonged to an adult man. The second was noticeably shorter, belonging to a person of very young age. They were walking toward the forest. The man, by his figure and manner of movement, turned out to be very similar to Pastor Joseph. Experts confirmed this was very likely him. What was even worse for the pastor, next to him walked Emma herself. Her clothing completely matched the description of that evening. This meant only one thing. The pastor had lied to the police. He was with Emma that evening, was with her one-on-one. The recording became that very piece of evidence after which denying the obvious was already meaningless. Joseph Miller turned out to be exactly where he categorically denied his presence, and was doing exactly what he persistently assured he had never done. Now there were no more questions and doubts. All facts converged at one point, finally confirming the terrible suspicions that no one in town wanted to think about until the last moment. The pastor, who had been protected for so long and who was so trusted, turned out to be the one who should have been feared most of all. After being presented with irrefutable evidence, Pastor Joseph Miller had nothing left to object with. The video recording from the store camera was so obvious that even Miller's lawyer silently set aside the folder with documents, understanding that there was nothing to defend here. The last conversation with detectives took place late in the evening, and this time Joseph did not remain silent or deny the obvious. He began to speak, slowly, as if each word was given with great difficulty. He confessed that he was the one who ended up next to Emma that evening. Miller told how he suggested she take a walk in the forest, promising to show her a special place where they could pray to fulfill her most cherished wish. Emma agreed immediately, trusting a person she considered wise and kind, and with whom she felt safe. There, in a quiet and secluded place, he tried to cross a certain line that Emma instantly sensed. The pastor confessed that he became frightened by her reaction when she sharply pulled away, saying she would tell her parents everything. At that moment, he lost control of the situation and acted in a way he could not later explain even to himself. To protect himself from consequences, he decided on the most terrible thing. He did not give unnecessary details, did not describe the moment itself, but his brief confession was sufficient for the record. Joseph's words sounded quiet, monotone, without the slightest attempt to justify himself or evoke sympathy. When the investigator asked about actions after what happened, Miller described in detail how he tried to hide what had occurred. Understanding that Emma's disappearance would immediately cause a resonance and mass searches, he decided to cover his tracks by framing a person who was already under suspicion. The choice fell on Jason Lee, a young janitor with a questionable reputation. For this, he stole his gray car, prepared children's items in advance which he specially placed inside to lead police on a false trail. Miller explained his decision simply. Jason was the perfect figure for suspicion. By stealing his car and scattering items, he hoped to maximally distract the investigation's attention and buy time to get himself out of harm's way. He only failed to account for one thing, that police would find his mistakes and lies so quickly. The trial was short, but tense. Town residents filled the hall completely. They wanted to personally make sure that the guilty party would be punished. Among those present were Emma's parents, Jason Lee, who had almost been imprisoned by mistake, and even Tom, the elderly neighbor who had been so actively suspected in the first days. During the hearings, Miller unexpectedly changed his testimony, claiming that the entire story had been fabricated by former assistant Mark Thompson, who allegedly deliberately planted all the evidence and coached witnesses to take revenge on the pastor. But his attempt to shift responsibility failed almost instantly. Cameras, witnesses, conversation recordings, DNA analyses, irrefutable evidence had been gathered against him, excluding any possibility of error. The prosecutor calmly and methodically destroyed each attempt by the pastor to defend himself, showing the court that all his lies were meaningless. With each argument from the prosecution, Joseph became increasingly dejected and silent. Eventually, he simply stopped responding, lowering his eyes and waiting for the court's decision. The verdict was announced quickly and without unnecessary comments. Joseph Miller was found guilty on all counts of the indictment and received the maximum possible sentence provided by law. When the judge read the decision, absolute silence reigned in the hall. No one uttered a word or sound. People watched the pastor as he was led out of the hall in handcuffs, trying to understand how a person they knew and loved could hide such evil within himself. Immediately after the trial, Emma's family left town. They did not want to remain where every corner of the streets reminded them of what happened to their daughter. Jason Lee received official apologies from the police but preferred not to return to his previous job, deciding to move where no one knows his story. Elderly neighbor Tom continued to live on his street but began coming out on the porch less often. Now he preferred to stay home, trying to avoid any unnecessary glances and conversations. Soon after the sentence was pronounced, silence again descended on the town. People tried not to discuss what had happened, as if this could erase memories of the tragedy. But it was impossible to pretend that nothing had occurred. Residents began to treat each other more cautiously, paying especially close attention to new people appearing in their small world. They had lost something important, the sense of complete safety and unconditional trust that had previously been natural here. The church where Pastor Miller had once served closed for a long time. Believers tried to avoid it, and in the evenings the building looked abandoned and gloomy. It took several months to begin regular services again, but there were far fewer parishioners. The story ended abruptly, leaving no room for long reflections or morals. For the town's residents, it became a harsh lesson that would never be forgotten. Everything that came after no longer mattered. What was important was only that at some point they had failed to see the true face of the one they trusted more than themselves. The town gradually returned to its usual rhythm of life, but now it was already a completely different town, and its residents would forever remember the price of trust.